The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was an ordinary day in May when Andy Clark collected his mail. Bills, ads, and a strange cream-colored envelope with his name typed neatly on the front. The return address showed a law firm in Boston. Andy frowned. He had never been to Boston, and he certainly didn't know any lawyers there. He tossed the envelope onto his kitchen counter and forgot about it while he heated up leftover pizza for dinner. After 12 hours fixing cars at Joe's auto shop, Andy was too tired to think about unexpected mail. The small TV in his apartment played an old Western movie as he ate. His one-bedroom apartment in Millfield, Ohio wasn't much, but it had been home for the past 8 years. The letter sat untouched for 3 days. Andy saw it each morning as he made coffee and each night when he came home from work. Finally, on Friday evening, curiosity got the better of him. He picked up the envelope, tore it open, and pulled out a formal letter on thick paper. "Dear Mr. Clark," it began, "we regret to inform you of the passing of your uncle, Frank Clark. As the executor of his estate, it is my duty to inform you that you have been named as the sole beneficiary in his will." Andy read the letter twice, then a third time. Uncle C. Frank was dead? And he had left Andy something? It didn't make sense. Andy barely remembered his uncle. Frank had been the strange, quiet brother of Andy's father. The family rarely spoke about him. The last time Andy had seen Frank was at a family Christmas party 15 years ago. Andy had been just 17. He remembered raised voices, his father red-faced with anger, and Frank walking out into the snowy night. No one ever explained what the fight was about, and Frank's name became taboo in the Clark household. Now this letter claimed that Frank had left Andy a substantial inheritance, including real estate property at 145 Ocean Drive, Harbor Point, Massachusetts, and all contents therein, as well as financial assets totaling approximately $178,000. Andy sat down hard on his worn couch. That was more money than he had ever seen in his life. And a house? In Massachusetts? By the ocean? It had to be a mistake. The next morning, Andy called the number on the letter. A woman with a crisp Boston accent confirmed everything. It was real. His Uncle Frank had indeed left him everything. "When can I come see the property?" Andy asked. "At your convenience, Mr. Clark. The keys are waiting for you at our office. The house has been vacant since your uncle's passing 3 months ago." Andy hung up and looked around his small apartment. The paint was peeling in the bathroom. The refrigerator made a constant humming noise. The carpet was stained from the previous tenant. What was keeping him here? His job paid the bills, but not much more. He had no girlfriend, no close family nearby. His parents had moved to Florida years ago, and they rarely called. By Monday, Andy had made up his mind. He gave notice at his apartment and at the auto shop. Joe was disappointed but understanding. "Can't blame you for taking a chance like this," his boss said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Not every day someone hands you a fresh start." Andy packed his life into his old Ford pickup truck. It didn't take long. Some clothes, tools, a few books, his laptop, and a photo album. Everything else he either sold or gave away. 2 weeks after receiving the letter, he was on the road heading east. The drive took 2 days. Andy stayed at a cheap motel just outside of Pittsburgh on the first night. As he lay in the lumpy bed, doubt crept in. Was he being foolish? Throwing away a steady job for what might be a wild goose chase? What if the house was falling apart? What if there was a catch? But in the morning, with the rising sun, his determination returned. If it didn't work out, he could always come back. Mechanics were needed everywhere. The law office was in a tall building in downtown Boston. Andy felt out of place in his jeans and work boots as he rode the elevator to the 12th floor. The receptionist smiled politely and led him to a conference room where Mr. Phillips, a gray-haired man in an expensive suit, was waiting. "Mr. Clark, welcome to Boston," the lawyer said, shaking Andy's hand. "I have the papers for you to sign, and then the property and accounts will be officially transferred to your name." As Andy signed document after document, Mr. Phillips explained, "Some things about Uncle Frank. Your uncle was a very private man but well respected in Harbor Point. He moved there in the late 1970s and became something of a local fixture. He was a marine biologist by training, though I believe he retired from active research some years ago. Andy nodded, trying to absorb this information. His father had never mentioned Frank's profession. Did he say why he left everything to me? Andy asked. We weren't close. Mr. Phillips adjusted his glasses. He never explained his decision to me, I'm afraid. But he was very clear about it. Everything was to go to you, his only nephew. After the paperwork was done, Mr. Phillips handed Andy a large envelope containing the house keys, property information, bank details, and a hand-drawn map to Harbor Point. It's about an hour north of the city, Mr. Phillips said. Lovely coastal town, very quiet, especially before the summer season. Andy thanked the lawyer and returned to his truck. Following the map, he drove north out of Boston. The highway eventually gave way to smaller roads that wound closer to the coastline. The air coming through his open window smelled of salt. It was a new smell for someone who had lived his whole life in Ohio. Harbor Point appeared suddenly around a bend in the road. A small sign welcomed visitors to the town, population 3,242. The main street was lined with shops painted in various shades of blue, gray, and white. People walked dogs or sat on benches. No one seemed in a hurry. Andy followed the directions to Ocean Drive, which curved along the coastline north of town. The houses here were larger, set back from the road with views of the Atlantic. Number 145 was near the end of the road, partially hidden by tall pine trees. Andy's heart beat faster as he turned into the gravel driveway. Through the trees, he caught his first glimpse of his inheritance. It was a two-story Victorian house, gray with white trim and a wide porch that wrapped around the front. It stood on a slight rise with the ocean visible beyond it. The truck's tires crunched to a stop. Andy sat for a moment, taking it all in. The house was bigger than he had imagined. It looked old, but solid. A stone path led from the driveway to the front steps. With the key in his hand, Andy walked up to the house that was now his. The key turned easily in the lock and the front door swung open with a soft creak. The air inside smelled of dust and something else. Old books, perhaps, or wood polish. Andy stepped into a wide entryway. To his right was a living room with large windows facing the ocean. To his left, a formal dining room. Straight ahead, a wooden staircase led to the second floor. The house was fully furnished, as if someone might return at any moment. There were books on the shelves, dishes in the cabinets, even clothes in the closets. It felt strange to walk through his uncle's life this way, looking at the things Frank had touched and used. In the study, Andy found photographs on the walls. Many showed ocean scenes or boats, but some were of people. In one, Andy recognized a much younger version of his uncle, standing on a dock beside a woman with long dark hair. They were both smiling at the camera, the ocean behind them. Andy had never seen the woman before. Was she his uncle's wife? Girlfriend? The family had never mentioned Frank being married. As the afternoon light began to fade, Andy returned to his truck to bring in his few belongings. The house had electricity and running water, though everything had a disused feel. Andy found clean sheets in a linen closet and made up the bed in what he assumed was the guest room. Sleeping in his uncle's room felt too strange. That night, Andy lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds. The distant crash of waves, the wind in the pine trees, the occasional creak of the old house settling. Everything was different from his apartment in Ohio. The air, the sounds, the feel of the mattress beneath him. He wondered about his Uncle Frank, living alone in this big house by the sea. What had driven him away from his family? Why had he left everything to a nephew he barely knew? Andy fell asleep with questions spinning in his mind. In the morning, he would begin to explore his new home properly. Maybe somewhere in this house, he would find answers about the uncle he never knew, and the surprising gift he had been given. Andy woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then the sound of seagulls and distant waves brought it all back. He was in Harbor Point, in his uncle's house. His house now. He showered in the upstairs bathroom with its old-fashioned clawfoot tub. The water pressure was surprisingly good for such an old house. Afterward, he explored the kitchen, opening cabinets and drawers. He found coffee and filters, but no food besides some canned soup and crackers. Shopping would have to be his first task of the day. Andy stepped out onto the back porch and took a deep breath of the morning air. The view was even better in daylight. The property extended about 50 yards to a wooden fence, beyond which was a steep drop to a rocky beach below. A narrow path with wooden steps led down to the shore. The ocean stretched to the horizon, blue and vast. Andy had never lived near water before. The endless movement of the waves was hypnotic. A small building stood at the edge of the property, near the path to the beach. It looked like a workshop or shed. Andy made a mental note to check it out later. After a quick cup of coffee, Andy drove into town. Harbor Point was quiet in the morning. He found a small grocery store called Mariner's Market and filled a cart with essentials. The cashier, an older woman with gray hair and a neat bun, looked at him curiously. "You're new in town," she said. "It wasn't a question. Just moved in yesterday," Andy replied. "I inherited my uncle's house on Ocean Drive." The woman's eyes widened slightly. "You're Frank Clark's nephew?" Andy nodded, surprised. "Did you know him?" "Everyone knew Frank," she said, bagging his groceries. "He was a fixture around here for decades. I'm Margaret, by the way. Margaret Allen." "Andy Clark," he said, shaking her hand. "Well, Andy Clark, welcome to Harbor Point." She handed him his bags. Frank was a good man, kept to himself mostly, but always had a kind word. We were all sorry when he passed. "What happened to him?" Andy asked. The lawyer hadn't mentioned how his uncle died. "Heart attack," they said. "Very sudden. He was out on his boat one morning and didn't come back by evening. The Coast Guard found him." Margaret's eyes grew sad. At least he was doing what he loved. Andy thanked her for the information and promised to return soon. As he walked back to his truck, he realized that the people here might know more about his uncle than his own family ever did. Back at the house, Andy put away the groceries and continued his exploration. The place was bigger than he initially thought. Besides the main rooms downstairs, there was a sunroom at the back overlooking the ocean. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. One of the bedrooms had been converted into a home office, with a large desk facing the window and bookshelves lining the walls. Andy sat in his uncle's chair and looked around. The desk was neat, with a few papers stacked in a tray. A laptop sat closed in the center. Andy opened it, but it was password protected. The bookshelves held volumes on marine biology, local history, and fiction. There were framed diplomas on one wall, a bachelor's degree and doctorate in marine biology from the University of Massachusetts. In one of the drawers, Andy found a small leather-bound book. It was a journal with entries dating back several years. Andy hesitated, feeling like an intruder in his uncle's private thoughts, but curiosity won out. The journal contained observations about the local marine life, weather patterns, and occasional personal notes. Frank's handwriting was small and precise. Andy flipped through the pages, stopping occasionally to read an entry. April 15th. Spotted the first right whales of the season today. At least 3 adults moving north. Water temperature is rising earlier than last year. June 8th. Lily would have been 68 today. Took flowers to the usual spot. Andy paused at this entry. Lily, the same name as the woman in the photograph downstairs. He continued reading, hoping to find more clues. September 30th. Found another plastic waste collection on the North Beach. Filled 3 bags. When will people learn? December 24th. Another Christmas alone. Thought about calling the family, but what would be the point after all these years? Some rifts can't be mended. That last entry made Andy's chest tighten. Had his uncle wanted to reconnect with the family? Andy had been too young to understand the argument that had separated Frank from the rest of the Clarks. His father never explained what happened, only that Frank had betrayed the family somehow. Andy closed the journal, feeling a mix of sadness and curiosity. He made himself a sandwich for lunch and ate it on the back porch watching the waves. Afterward, he decided to check out the workshop he had noticed earlier. The small building was locked. Andy tried several keys from the set the lawyer had given him before finding one that worked. The door swung open with a creak. Inside, the workshop was well organized but dusty. Tools hung on a pegboard wall. A large work table took up the center of the space with various projects in different stages of completion. There were fishing rods, wooden carvings, and what looked like parts of a small boat engine. In the corner, under a tarp, was something large. Andy pulled the cover back to reveal a wooden rowboat. It was about 12 feet long, beautifully crafted but unfinished. The hull was complete, but it needed sanding and varnishing. A notebook on the workbench nearby contained detailed plans for the boat, with Frank's neat handwriting and precise drawings. Andy ran his hand along the smooth wood of the boat. It was solid craftsmanship. His uncle had obviously been skilled with his hands. Andy had inherited some of that talent. Working as a mechanic had given him an appreciation for well-made things and the patience to fix what was broken. A stack of books on a shelf caught Andy's eye. They were all about traditional boat building. One had a bookmark in it. Andy opened to that page and found a photograph being used as a marker. It showed his uncle standing proudly next to a completed wooden boat, similar to the one under construction. The photo was dated 15 years ago. As the afternoon wore on, Andy found himself drawn back to town. He wanted to learn more about his uncle and the life he had built here. The main street was busier now, with people shopping or eating at the small restaurants and cafes. Andy spotted a sign for Harbor Point Library and headed inside. The building was cool and quiet, with tall windows letting in natural light. A woman sat at the front desk typing on a computer. She looked up as Andy approached. "Can I help you?" she asked with a friendly smile. "I hope so," Andy said. "I'm new in town. Just inherited my uncle's house on Ocean Drive. Frank Clark. I'm trying to learn more about him." The woman's smile widened. "You're Frank's nephew? I'm Susan Green, the head librarian here. Your uncle was one of our most regular patrons." "He was?" Andy hadn't thought of his uncle as a reader. "Oh yes. He loved books on local history, marine life, boat building, you name it. He also donated generously to our marine science section." Susan stood up. "Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." Andy accepted, and soon they were sitting in Susan's small office at the back of the library. Susan was about Andy's age, with short brown hair and glasses. She spoke about Frank with obvious affection. He used to give talks here sometimes about the local marine ecosystem. The kids especially loved when he brought in specimens from his collection. Starfish, shells, that kind of thing. Susan sipped her coffee. He was knowledgeable but never talked down to anyone. He made science exciting. "It sounds like you knew him well," Andy said. Susan nodded. "Harbor Point is a small town. Everyone knows everyone. But yes, Frank and I were friends. I was worried about him living alone out there after his heart started giving him trouble last year." "I had no idea he was sick," Andy admitted. "My family, we weren't in touch." Susan's expression was sympathetic but not prying. "He mentioned that once or twice, said he had family in Ohio but they weren't close. He never went into details." Andy finished his coffee, feeling a strange mix of emotions. His uncle had built a life here with friends and respect. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, the family had acted as if Frank didn't exist. "There's a diner just down the street," Susan said as Andy was leaving. "The Harbor Cafe. Frank ate there almost every day for lunch. If you want to know more about him, that might be a good place to start." Andy thanked her for the suggestion. Outside, the late afternoon sun was warm on his face. He found the Harbor Cafe easily, a small building with blue trim and a sign showing a lighthouse. Inside, it was cozy and smelled of coffee and pie. Andy took a seat at the counter and ordered a burger and coffee. As he waited for his food, he looked around at the photos on the walls. Many showed local scenes, the harbor, fishing boats, the town in different seasons. And there, near the register, was a picture of his Uncle Frank standing with the diner's staff, everyone smiling widely. His uncle had left him more than just a house and money, Andy realized. He had left him a community, a place where Frank Clark had mattered to people. And somehow that felt like the most valuable part of his inheritance. Andy spent his first week in Harbor Point settling into a routine. Each morning he woke early with the sunlight and had coffee on the back porch, watching the ocean. He was still amazed that this view was now his. After breakfast, he would work on the house for a few hours. Though the place was structurally sound, it needed some updates and repairs. The roof had a few loose shingles, some windows stuck when opened, and the back steps needed replacing. Andy found that his skills as a mechanic translated well to home repair. He enjoyed the work, finding satisfaction in fixing things with his hands. Each small repair made the house feel more like his own. In the afternoons, Andy often visited the town. He became a regular at the Harbor Cafe, where the owner, Pete, always greeted him warmly. "Your uncle used to sit right there," Pete told him one day, pointing to a corner table by the window. "Every day at 1 o'clock like clockwork. Always ordered the fish chowder." Andy nodded, absorbing this small detail about his uncle. "Did he come alone?" "Usually," Pete said, refilling Andy's coffee cup. Though sometimes Susan from the library would join him, or Dr. Hayes from the Marine Research Center. They'd talk for hours about tide patterns and fish migration. "Way over my head," Dr. Hayes, another name to add to the growing list of people who had known Frank. Andy made a mental note to visit the Marine Research Center soon. Later that day, Andy returned to the workshop behind the house. He had been spending more time there lately, drawn to the unfinished boat. It seemed wrong to leave his uncle's final project incomplete. Andy had never built a boat before, but the detailed plans Frank had left made the process clear. And after years of fixing engines, Andy was good at following technical instructions. He started by organizing the workshop, cleaning tools that had gathered dust, and taking inventory of supplies. Frank had been well prepared. There was plenty of sandpaper, varnish, and all the necessary hardware to complete the boat. As Andy worked, he felt a strange connection to his uncle. They had barely known each other in life. But here, using Frank's tools and following his plans, Andy sensed a kinship. They shared not just blood, but an appreciation for craftsmanship and working with their hands. The next day, Andy visited the Harbor Point Marine Research Center. It was a modest building near the town dock with a sign showing various fish species native to the area. Inside, a young man at the reception desk directed Andy to Dr. Hayes' office. Dr. Olivia Hayes was a woman in her 60s with short silver hair and keen blue eyes. Her office was cluttered with books, papers, and specimens in jars. She looked up from her computer as Andy knocked on the open door. "Dr. Hayes, I'm Andy Clark, Frank Clark's nephew." Recognition flashed in her eyes. "Frank's nephew? Yes, come in, come in." She cleared some papers from a chair. "I've been meaning to stop by and welcome you to town. Things have been busy here with our spring monitoring program." Andy sat down, taking in the office. Photos on the wall showed Dr. Hayes and various research teams on boats and beaches. In one picture, Andy spotted his uncle, younger than in other photos he'd seen, standing proudly on a research vessel. "You worked with my uncle?" Andy asked. "For many years," Dr. Hayes said. "Frank was one of our most dedicated researchers before he retired. His work on the local mussel population is still referenced in current studies." She smiled at the photo Andy had noticed. That was taken about 20 years ago during a particularly successful research season. "I'm learning that my uncle had quite a life here," Andy said. "My family and we didn't keep in touch." Dr. Hayes' expression grew more serious. "Frank mentioned that. He didn't share details, but I gathered there had been some falling out." She leaned forward. "But he spoke of you a few times." "He did?" Andy was surprised. "What did he say?" "He kept a newspaper clipping about you winning some statewide mechanics competition in high school. He was proud of that. Said you had a natural talent with machines, just like he did with boats." Andy felt a lump in his throat. He vaguely remembered that competition, fixing a deliberately sabotaged engine in record time. He had no idea his uncle had known about it, much less kept a clipping. I never realized he paid attention to what I was doing, Andy said quietly. Dr. Hayes nodded. Frank was a private person, but he cared deeply, not just about people, but about this place. She gestured toward the window, where the harbor was visible. He dedicated his life to understanding and protecting the ecosystem here. I found his journal, Andy said. He mentioned someone named Lily. Do you know who that was? A shadow passed over Dr. Hayes's face. Lily was his wife. They were married for just 3 years before she died. Cancer, very aggressive. It was about 30 years ago now. Andy was stunned. His wife? My family never mentioned he was married. From what Frank told me, they didn't approve of the marriage. Lily was an environmental activist. She and Frank met during a protest against an oil company that wanted to build a refinery near here. The company had ties to Frank's family business, I believe. Suddenly, pieces began falling into place. Andy's grandfather had owned a construction company that often worked with oil and gas industries. He remembered his father talking about a big contract they had lost years ago due to environmental nuts. So that's what the fight was about, Andy murmured. My family blamed him for losing business. Frank chose his principles and Lily over family approval, Dr. Hayes said. After she died, he threw himself into research and conservation. It became his life's work, carrying on what they had started together. Andy stayed at the research center for another hour, learning more about his uncle's work. Dr. Hayes showed him reports Frank had written, samples he had collected, and the ongoing projects that had grown from his initial research. He made a difference here, Dr. Hayes said as Andy was leaving. That's not something everyone can say at the end of their life. There, Andy drove back to the house with his mind swirling. His uncle had stood up for what he believed in, even when it cost him his family. He had loved and lost his wife, then built a meaningful life dedicated to her memory. It was far from the vague, dismissive stories Andy had heard growing up. That evening, Andy returned to the attic. He had briefly explored it during his first days in the house, but hadn't looked closely at everything. Now he searched more carefully through the boxes of old photographs and papers. In one dusty box, he found what he was looking for, a wedding album. The photos showed a younger Frank, beaming with happiness, standing beside the dark-haired woman from the other pictures. Lily. She was beautiful with a vibrant smile and intelligent eyes. They looked blissfully happy together. Another box contained protest signs, newspaper clippings about the proposed refinery, and letters from environmental organizations thanking Frank and Lily for their support. The refinery had never been built. The protesters had won. Andy sat cross-legged on the attic floor, surrounded by the evidence of his uncle's life. The man who emerged from these boxes was passionate, principled, and loving, nothing like the vague villain from family stories. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the attic windows, Andy made a decision. He would finish his uncle's boat, and he would learn more about Frank's environmental work. His uncle had left him this house for a reason. Perhaps he had hoped Andy would understand his life in a way the rest of the family never had. Andy carefully packed away the wedding album and other mementos. Then he went downstairs to the kitchen and called his parents in Florida. It was time to hear their side of the story about Uncle Frank, and it was time to tell them that the family traitor had been, in fact, a man of principle and courage. The phone rang several times before his mother answered. Andy, is everything okay? It's late. Everything's fine, Mom, Andy said. But I need to ask you about Uncle Frank. I need to know the whole story. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then his mother sighed. I suppose it's time you knew. Let me get your father. Andy settled into a kitchen chair, prepared for a difficult conversation. Outside the window, the moon cast a silver path across the dark ocean. His uncle's ocean. And now, in some way, his own. The phone call with his parents lasted over an hour. Andy sat at the kitchen table listening as years of family secrets unraveled. His father was reluctant at first, defensive about the old conflict with Frank. But as the conversation continued, the full story emerged. Your grandfather was furious, his father explained. That refinery contract would have been the biggest job our company ever had. When Frank joined those protesters, it was like he was attacking his own family. He was standing up for what he believed in, Andy said. His father sighed. I see that now, but back then it felt like betrayal. And when he married that woman, Lily, Andy corrected. Her name was Lily. Yes, Lily. When he married her, it was the final straw for your grandfather. He cut Frank off completely, forbade any of us from contacting him. And you just went along with it? Andy couldn't keep the accusation from his voice. I was young, Andy. I had just joined the family business. I was afraid of losing my inheritance. His father's voice grew quiet. By the time I realized how wrong we were, too many years had passed. Pride gets in the way. Did you know Lily died? That Frank was alone all these years? There was a long pause. We heard about Lily. Your Aunt Mary saw the obituary. But by then, it had been so long, we didn't know what to say. The conversation ended with no real resolution. His parents promised to visit soon to see the house and maybe begin to make amends with Frank's memory. Andy wasn't sure how he felt about that. Part of him wanted to protect his uncle's peaceful home from the family that had rejected him. Dikir. Next morning, Andy woke early and went straight to the workshop. Working on the boat gave him time to think. The rhythmic motion of sanding the wooden hull was soothing. His uncle must have found similar peace in this work. After a few hours, Andy took a break and walked down the steps to the beach. The tide was out, revealing tide pools among the rocks. He crouched down to examine one, fascinated by the tiny ecosystem within. Small crabs scuttled between stones. Sea anemones waved their tentacles in the shallow water. Andy remembered his uncle's journal entries about the local marine life and saw it now with new appreciation. A voice called out, interrupting his thoughts. Good morning. Perfect day for exploring the tide pools. Andy looked up to see Susan from the library walking along the beach toward him. She wore jeans rolled up to her knees and carried a small bucket. I hope you don't mind, she said as she approached. This beach has the best tide pools in the area. I bring my nephew here sometimes to collect specimens for his science class. Not at all, Andy said, standing up. It's nice to have company. Susan knelt beside a large pool. Frank used to give me tours of these pools. He knew every species, where they like to hide, their habits. It was like having a personal marine biology professor. Andy smiled, liking this new glimpse of his uncle. He sounds like he was a good teacher. The best, Susan agreed. She reached carefully into the water and lifted out a starfish for Andy to see. 5-armed sea star, very common here but still beautiful. They spent the next hour exploring the tide pools together. Susan knew almost as much as Frank had about the local sea life. She showed Andy the difference between edible and non-edible seaweed, pointed out the tiny fish darting between rocks, and explained how barnacles fed themselves. You know, she said as they climbed back up the steps to Andy's yard, there's an annual beach cleanup happening this weekend. It was something Frank never missed. The whole town turns out to pick up trash along the shoreline. You might want to join. I'd like that, Andy said. He hesitated, then added, Would you like to see his boat? The one he was building? Susan's eyes lit up. He mentioned he was working on a new one. I'd love to see it. In the workshop, Susan circled the half-finished rowboat with obvious admiration. Beautiful craftsmanship. Frank built 3 others like this over the years. He used to take them out early in the morning to check his research sites. I'm trying to finish it, Andy said, following his plans. I've never built a boat before, but it seems like the right thing to do. Susan ran her hand along the smooth curve of the bow. It's exactly the right thing to do, and you're doing a good job so far. Andy felt a surge of pride at her approval. Thanks, it's coming along slowly, but I'm learning as I go. That's how Frank approached boat building too. Each one was a learning experience. The last boat he finished is still down at the harbor. He donated it to the kids' sailing program. After Susan left, Andy returned to work with renewed energy. By late afternoon, he had completed sanding the entire hull and was ready to begin applying the first coat of sealant. As he cleaned up the workshop, He noticed a framed document hanging on the wall that he hadn't paid much attention to before. It was a certificate from the Harbor Point Conservation Trust, thanking Frank for his generous donation of protected coastal land. Andy studied the certificate, wondering what land it referred to. He remembered seeing some conservation trust papers among the documents the lawyer had given him. That evening, he dug through the files until he found what he was looking for. 5 years ago, Frank had donated 20 acres of woodland and coastline adjacent to his property to the Conservation Trust. The land would remain undeveloped forever, protected habitat for local wildlife. According to the agreement, Frank had retained lifetime access rights to the research stations he had established there. The next day, Andy visited the Conservation Trust office in town. The director, Bill Peterson, greeted him warmly. "We were wondering when you'd stop by," Bill said, shaking Andy's hand. "Your uncle was one of our biggest supporters. That coastal donation was incredibly valuable. Developers would have paid millions for that land." "I'd like to see it," Andy said. The research stations he mentioned. Bill was happy to oblige. That afternoon, he led Andy on a hike through the protected land. They followed narrow trails through pine forests until they reached a series of small, weatherproof sheds built on rocky outcroppings overlooking the ocean. Frank built these himself, Bill explained, unlocking the first shed. Each one contains equipment for monitoring different aspects of the ecosystem: water quality, bird migration, seal populations, that sort of thing. Inside, Andy found a simple but effective setup. Weather-resistant computers connected to various sensors, all powered by small solar panels on the roof. Logbooks showed years of careful data collection. "He came out here every week, rain or shine," Bill said. "Even in his 70s, with his heart giving him trouble, he was dedicated." Andy ran his hand over one of the logbooks, noting his uncle's familiar handwriting. The last entry was dated just 3 days before he died. "The data he collected has been invaluable," Bill continued. "It's given us a 15-year baseline for the health of this coastline. We've used it to fight against offshore drilling proposals, challenge pollution permits, everything." "Is someone continuing his work?" Andy asked. Bill shook his head. "We check the equipment occasionally, but we don't have anyone with his expertise or dedication. The high school science classes use some of the data for projects, but it's not the same as having a trained marine biologist out here regularly." As they hiked back to town, Andy's mind was working. He wasn't a marine biologist, but he was good with mechanical equipment. Surely he could learn to maintain the monitoring stations. And perhaps the high school students who use the data could become more involved. It seemed wrong to let his uncle's work fade away. That night, Andy sat on the back porch watching the sunset over the ocean. From here he could see part of the protected coastline his uncle had donated. In the fading light, he spotted a pair of seals playing in the water near the shore. Frank had helped preserve this place for them, and for all the life in the tide pools, and for the people of Harbor Point. Andy thought about his life back in Ohio. The garage where he had worked was already advertising for his replacement. His apartment had been rented to someone new. No one there would miss him the way this town had missed his uncle. Inside the house, on the kitchen counter, was a flyer for the beach cleanup Susan had mentioned. Andy had put his name down as a volunteer. It felt like a small step, but in the right direction. His uncle had left him more than a house and a boat to finish. He had left him a purpose if Andy was willing to accept it. He watched the seals until they disappeared into the darkening water. Then he went inside, turned on the lights, and began making plans for the next day. For the first time since arriving in Harbor Point, the house truly felt like home. 2 months passed quickly. The New England spring turned to early summer, bringing warmer days and more tourists to Harbor Point. Andy settled deeper into the rhythm of the small coastal town. Each day he spent hours working on his uncle's boat, which was now nearly complete. The wooden hull gleamed with multiple coats of varnish, and the brass fittings shone in the sunlight that streamed through the workshop windows. The beach cleanup that Susan had mentioned turned out to be a turning point for Andy. Nearly half the town had shown up that Saturday morning, armed with garbage bags and gloves. Andy worked alongside families, shopkeepers, and fishermen, all united in their care for the coastline. By the end of the day, they had collected over 30 bags of trash, mostly plastic waste that had washed ashore. During lunch break, Dr. Hayes had introduced Andy to the high school science teacher, Ben Wilson. When Andy mentioned his interest in maintaining his uncle's research stations, Ben's eyes lit up. "That would be amazing," Ben had said. "I've been taking students out there for years, but we've been worried about losing access since Frank passed. The data is invaluable for our marine science program." That conversation led to a new arrangement. Twice a week, Andy met Ben and a small group of students at the trailhead to the conservation land. Together, they hiked to the research stations, where Andy taught them how to maintain the equipment while Ben explained the scientific importance of the data they collected. At first, Andy had worried that he wasn't qualified. "I'm a mechanic, not a scientist," he had told Ben. "That's exactly what we need," Ben had replied. "These kids know the science. What they don't know is how to keep the sensors calibrated and the solar panels working." Frank handled all that himself, and so Andy found himself as an unofficial teacher, sharing his mechanical knowledge while learning about marine ecosystems from Ben and the students. They were a good team. The monitoring continued, and Frank's years of data remained unbroken. Today was a special day. After weeks of careful work, the boat was finally ready for its maiden voyage. Andy had risen at dawn to move it from the workshop to the beach. Now it sat on the sand, waiting for the morning high tide. Andy ran his hand along the smooth gunwale. The boat was beautiful, 12 feet of gleaming cedar with 2 rowing positions and a small forward deck. He had followed Frank's plans exactly, down to the carved compass rose on the bow. The only change he had made was the name painted in careful blue letters on the stern: Lily's Legacy. Footsteps on the sand made him look up. Susan was walking toward him, carrying a small wicker basket. "I thought you might want company for the big launch," she said with a smile. "And I brought breakfast," Andy smiled back. Over the past months, Susan had become a good friend. They had spent many evenings together, sometimes talking about Frank, sometimes about books or music or their own lives before Harbor Point. "Perfect timing," Andy said. "The tide will be high enough in about 20 minutes. They sat on a blanket, near the boat, sharing coffee from a thermos and blueberry muffins from Susan's basket. The morning sun warmed the air, and seagulls called overhead. "Frank would be proud," Susan said, nodding toward the boat. "It's beautiful work." "I hope so," Andy replied. "There were moments when I wasn't sure I could finish it. But you did, and now you're keeping his research going too." Andy nodded. Working with the high school students had given him a sense of purpose he hadn't expected to find in Harbor Point. His mechanical skills, which had seemed ordinary back in Ohio, were valuable here. He was contributing something meaningful. More footsteps approached, and Andy looked up to see Dr. Hayes and Ben Wilson, along with a small group of the science students. Behind them came Pete from the cafe, Margaret from the grocery store, and several other townspeople Andy had come to know. "Hope you don't mind an audience," Dr. Hayes called out. Word got around that today was launch day. Andy stood up, surprised and touched by the turnout. Not at all, the more the merrier. The next half hour was filled with cheerful conversation as more people arrived. Someone brought donuts, someone else a cooler of cold drinks. It turned into an impromptu beach party, with the gleaming boat as the centerpiece. As the tide reached its peak, Andy and Ben pushed the boat into the shallow water. It floated perfectly, just as Frank's plans had promised it would. A cheer went up from the gathered crowd. Andy climbed in first, testing the balance. Then he held out his hand to Susan. "Care to join the maiden voyage?" She stepped carefully into the boat and settled onto the forward seat. Andy took the rowing position and pushed off with an oar. The boat glided smoothly into deeper water. The oars felt right in his hands, the rhythm of rowing coming naturally. They moved parallel to the shore for a while, the boat responding perfectly to Andy's strokes. From the beach, people waved and took pictures. "Let's go a bit farther out," Andy suggested. "I want to see how she handles in deeper water." Susan nodded, trailing her fingers in the clear ocean water as they moved away from shore. The morning was calm, with just a light breeze rippling the surface. Perfect conditions for a first voyage. When they were about a quarter-mile out, Andy shipped the oars and let the boat drift. From this distance, he could see his uncle's house. His house now, perched on the cliff above the beach. The small crowd of well-wishers looked like colorful dots on the sand. "I never expected any of this," Andy said quietly. "When I got that letter about the inheritance, I thought it would just be a house to sell. I never imagined finding a home," Susan suggested when he trailed off. Andy nodded. "Exactly. Finding a home. Finding people who knew my uncle better than his own family did. Finding work that matters." They floated in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the gentle motion of the waves rocking the boat. Then Susan reached into her pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I've been waiting for the right moment to give you this," she said, handing it to Andy. "Frank left it with me about a year ago, after his first heart scare. He asked me to give it to you if you ever came to Harbor Point." Andy took the envelope, surprised. His name was written on the front in his uncle's neat handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dated 14 months earlier. "Dear Andy," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've made your way to Harbor Point. I've left you my home because I believe you'll understand why I chose this place and this life. Your grandfather and father never could." Andy had to pause, his vision blurring slightly. He took a deep breath and continued reading. "I've watched your progress from afar over the years. The mechanics competition you won in high school. Your decision to work with your hands rather than follow the business path your father wanted for you. You remind me of myself at your age. Practical, independent, unwilling to simply follow the expected route. I don't know if you'll choose to stay in Harbor Point or sell the house and return to your life in Ohio. Either way, the choice is yours without strings or expectations. But I hope you'll at least spend some time here, get to know the community and the coastline I've worked to protect. The boat in my workshop was meant for you. I started building it after my heart attack, thinking I might live to finish it and perhaps even show you how to use it. If fate allows, perhaps you'll complete it yourself. Whatever you decide, know that at least one member of your family was always proud of you, even from a distance. Your Uncle Frank." Andy carefully folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. When he looked up, Susan was watching him with a gentle expression. "He knew I would come," Andy said. Susan nodded. "He hoped you would, but he wasn't sure. Your family situation was complicated." Andy looked back toward the shore, at the house on the cliff, at the people waiting on the beach. His parents were supposed to visit next month. He wasn't sure how that would go, but he was willing to try building that bridge. "Not that complicated anymore," he said. "I know where I belong now." He took up the oars again and began rowing back toward shore. The boat moved smoothly through the water, as if it had always been meant for this bay, these waves. Lily's legacy, carrying forward not just the names but the values of those who had come before. As they approached the beach, Andy could see Ben's, students eagerly waiting at the water's edge, ready to help pull the boat ashore. Beyond them stood the townspeople who had become his friends. And beyond them, on the cliff, stood the house that had become his home. The unexpected inheritance had turned out to be far more than property or money. It was a community, a purpose, a place to belong. It was his uncle's final gift, the chance to build a life that mattered in a place worth protecting. Andy shipped the oars and let the tide carry them the final distance to shore, where friendly hands reached out to welcome them home.